Hi, I'm Anna Saucier, host of Cycle Power Summit 2019, and I am so pleased to be here in this session with Dr. Mary Davenport. Dr. Davenport underwent training as a naprotechnology medical consultant at Pope Paul VI Institute, emphasizing therapies for infertility and hormonal problems in harmony with the human body, which was a life-changing experience for her. Recently, she attained a master's degree in nutrition and metabolism and is currently undergoing further training in functional medicine. Dr. Davenport has lectured widely in the US and internationally on infertility therapies, natural and ethical approaches to reproductive health care, abortion reversal and complications, maternal mortality, nutrition, and bioethics. She founded Magnificat Maternal Health Program to combat maternal mortality in central Nigeria with Father Simeon O'Malley and friends in the San Francisco Bay Area. Dr. Davenport, it is so great to meet you, and I am honored to host you here for this session.
Okay, I'm so happy to be with you and share some of this information.
Wonderful, thank you. So Dr. Davenport, the focus of our conversation here is adrenal fatigue. I am really looking forward to this because admittedly, I know extremely little about this, so I'm gonna learn a lot here. Can you begin by explaining what adrenal fatigue is?
Yes, well, adrenal fatigue is probably the best definition of it is a syndrome or collection of symptoms that falls short of the more serious condition called chronic. So it includes being tired or wired, stressed out, sleep disturbances, and exhaustion, and often mental fog, sometimes muscle aches and pains. It sort of varies from person to person, but it was originally described actually in animal experiments in the 1930s, and I think the definition has held up well. The only thing is it's sort of not a popular name or not an accepted name in normal Western medicine. I think it's because it was originally treated better by chiropractors and naturopaths, but there's actually been quite a bit of information on it if you use a different name, HPA axis dysregulation. So if you look on PubMed or medical research sources, there's a lot on HPA axis dysregulation, and that's sort of the more respectable name. But I think adrenal fatigue is a good name because it describes what's going on with a stress-related condition. Okay, well, if we talk about HPA axis dysregulation, your emotions and even physical stresses impact the hypothalamus high up in the brain. That impacts the pituitary that makes all of your regulating hormones like the thyroid stimulating hormone, the adrenal stimulating hormone, and then with stress, the pituitary puts out ACTH, and you will secrete a lot of cortisol, including other stress hormones like epinephrine or adrenaline from your adrenals. So that's kind of the short of it, what happens. But there are different stages to this. And the original work on cortisol was actually done by somebody named Hans Seeley in the 1930s. I'll get into that in just a second. But actually, the stress responses are good and appropriate. You know, when we were under more primitive circumstances and maybe cavemen, if there were animals attacking us, we needed to run away. And so the stress hormones are useful in terms of having our bodies aroused, faster heartbeat, raising the blood pressure, and making our bodies capable of fast action in life-threatening situations. But the big problem is we have these this HPA axis, it's called built into us, but what happens when our child flunks third grade, or we have a problem with our spouse, or have problems at work or something like that, all of these hormones and reactions come into place, and they're really inappropriate for modern life, but they're hard on us. And especially from the point of view of this summit, these stress hormones can impact our cycle and our ability to get pregnant. So sometimes before somebody can really find solutions for their fertility, they have to address stress. And so I'm going to show sort of more specifically how to do that. So the original experiments were on rats actually in the 1930s. So this is Hans Seely from Hungary, and he basically subjected rats to a lot of tortures, cold, shock, etc. But he did the original research, and we can use the same principles today. He found at first the adrenal gland would hypertrophy and grow and become swollen, and then eventually it would sort of shrink and become depleted. And he also found that there were vitamin C granules in the adrenal, and that's actually an important part of the treatment. And he observed that there were 3 stages: the alarm stage, and then there was sort of a stable stage of adaptation where the rats got along at a lower level, but they tolerated the stress, and then finally exhaustion, when their systems really gave out. So adrenal fatigue can be confused, or it really is maybe just part of the spectrum of chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, which includes very specific muscle points that are tender. So not everybody who has adrenal fatigue fits into that. Addison's disease is an extremely serious disease that's an autoimmune disease that's life-threatening. And adrenal fatigue shares some common points with depression, but it's most like chronic fatigue. If we look and see what chronic fatigue is, you have to meet all these criteria. And so the primary symptom is fatigue. It has to be severe, disabling, affecting physical and mental function. It has to be present for 6 months. There's other criteria in the US where you can have swollen lymph nodes or onset with the virus sometimes. But the main thing is not everybody who has something like that fits all the criteria. Okay, so it's a very useful concept for people who have stress-related problems, but it's not as severe as chronic fatigue syndrome. And we have a lot of other things in reproductive medicine that aren't exactly diseases, but they're useful syndromes and concepts, like PMS. That used to be considered, that for a long time was not respectable and not considered a real syndrome. And now there's treatments for that, and the way people can get adequate therapy for that if they're disabled during the premenstrual period. Or PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, that's the most common hormonal disease, and there's things that are called the Rotterdam criteria for that. So not everybody who has something like PCOS fits into the syndrome perfectly well, but utilizing the concept and the treatments can be very helpful. So similarly, adrenal fatigue is a useful idea. Not as bad as chronic fatigue, but has many of the same symptoms. And it really also corresponds to the same stages that Seely found in rats. In an alarm phase where someone is more wired and secreting a lot of cortisol and has maybe more sleep disturbances. Phase 2, where often they can get up in the morning, but they're crashing in the middle of the day, maybe need to have a lot of stimulants like coffee to keep going. And then phase 3, where they're really truly exhausted, have trouble getting out of bed in the morning, and it's really impairing.
Dr. Davenport, I'm
yes.
sorry. So with these phases, does this happen over time?
Yes.
Okay.
And sometimes there's a precipitating stress where someone has the flu and they never completely recover from influenza, and then ever since that time, things go wrong. So there's kind of a lot of variation in this, and people can be stuck in phase 2 for a really long time, or they can be in phase 1 and never get to phase 2 or phase 3. So there's a lot of variation, and you have to just sort of get to know the patient's symptoms really well and work with them and treat them sort of where they're at. but this is, this is a useful diagram here where you can figure out where people are in the spectrum. And it actually corresponds to one of the tests we do a lot. There's different physical tests for adrenal fatigue, but I find what's called the 4-point cortisol to be very useful. Not all the labs are equally good at this, but so cortisol is your stress hormone, and see the normal curve. These are just levels of cortisol. So when you get up in the morning, it's at a relatively high level and gradually goes down during the day. And you want it to be quieted down at night. You don't want it. You don't want to be aroused at night, so you can't sleep. So a healthy person will have a curve pretty much like this. Usually this 4-point cortisol is done with saliva, and there's a lot of literature showing that a good lab can be just as accurate as blood tests. And to do the 4-point cortisol, you really want to test it when you get up in the morning, you want to test it at midday, you want to test it at 4 p.m. in the afternoon, and then when you're going to bed. And that's very difficult to do in the lab and with blood draws. So that's why there are convenient kits where you can do saliva samples for the hormones. So
that's really cool. So
yeah,
you suspect that you're having this this problem, you can actually get a kit and do this at home. That's
yes.
Really
so it isn't 100% where it always reveals exactly what's going on, but it can be very useful. So we see stage 1, that's sort of the wired stage, where sometimes the cortisols are too high, and especially one of the things that happens is insomnia, not being able to sleep at night, and where the cortisol rises. So typically the person who has this isn't really exhausted, although there's quite a bit of variation in stage 1, and some people can really crash with this. And what's really interesting is there's actually a supplement that normalizes the cortisol curve. If somebody has what's called a reverse cortisol curve, where they're going up rather than going down during the day, phosphatidylserine, 100 to 300 milligrams a day, can actually turn the stage 1 kind of curve into normal. So for anybody who has the evening sleeplessness, that's a very useful supplement. And then we see with stage 2, then the cortisol is no longer high at some of the times. And so typically these people will be able to get up and cope. They're coping, but they crash in the middle of the day. And some people can go on for years like this. But then other people who don't cope very well may go on to stage 3. And so these people are very debilitated, and they can barely get up, drag themselves out of bed, and they're massively fatigued throughout the day. But it's sort of useful to do the test to get some of the numbers and see where you're at on the spectrum.
This is fascinating. I feel like I have so many questions. Can this happen with not huge stressors, but stress that is wearing on the system over time? Say, and
it can be. Yeah, there are many different causes. So it can be emotional stress, like a death in the family, relationship problems can do it, but it also can be, like I said, a viral illness can set it off. Actually, hormonal imbalance. Some women, when they're going into menopause and they start having sleeplessness from estrogen, the adrenal, it can actually stress out the HPA axis too, in addition to the sex hormones. And so in addition to just giving estrogen and hormonal support for estrogen and progesterone, you also have to address the adrenal component and the stress component. But there are many different causes of it, and it can be sudden, but sometimes it can be gradual, where you're just worn down over time, and you can't pinpoint a time.
As a mom, as a mom with little kids who don't sleep through the night, this is sounding a little bit familiar.
Yeah, the sleep is huge, because you cannot get over this, and sometimes you cannot prevent a downward spiral without improving sleep. That's the number one. And so some people will be in a situation where they say, well, I can't, I have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to, go to my job, and I go to bed at 11. Well, if you have this problem, you are not going to get over it if you go to bed at 11 and have to get up at 5. You have to totally change your schedule, reset your lifestyle, so you get 8 hours of sleep. That's a must. That's sort of like the first thing you have to do. And even if you need supplements, you do lifestyle changes to prevent sleep. It's called sleep hygiene. You don't eat close to bedtime. You don't do screen activities like checking your email or watching TV. You sort of have a quiet time before bedtime, have a dark bedroom, don't have alcohol within a couple hours of going to bed, and then use supplements or even drugs to help you go to sleep, because you will not get over this unless you sleep for 8 hours. And you can make it up a little bit if you get 7 hours and then sleep a long time on the weekend, but you will do much better if you make it a regular part of your life to get your 8 hours sleep. That's
Okay.
number one.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I want to ask you about one clarification just for our audience. You've talked about the HPA axis.
Yes.
I think I understand that correctly. Is that hormones, pituitary, and adrenal?
Hypothalamus.
Hypothalamus. Okay.
Yeah, up higher in the brain. Hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal. Some people will use the concept hippocampus too, which is sort of an emotional center, but usually it's hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal.
And the important thing is that those are all very much interconnected. Okay.
They're all interrelated.
Good. Thank you for clarifying that.
Right. So I sort of wanted to go on and talk about how can this impact your cycles and fertility and cause disturbances with your menstrual periods. So we want to look at the ovary and what happens in a normal cycle. Normally there's these primordial follicles, and at the beginning of the cycle, even during your period or even a little before, a few follicles develop, and sort of one picks out to be the dominant follicle. It develops. The egg is inside the follicle, and at this point it's putting out estrogen. And then if your cycle is working well, you ovulate and release the egg. And then after ovulation, the follicle will put out progesterone. And lots of menstrual disturbances in women have to do with inadequate progesterone. It's behind endometriosis. It impacts PMS, premenstrual syndrome. It impacts polycystic ovarian diseases. Inadequate progesterone is just huge. Okay, so you could certainly give a woman progesterone here, but even better is to even go back in the cycle and figure out what are these stresses that are preventing the woman from having a good cycle and putting out good progesterone in that point of the cycle.
Right, because just for our audience to clarify, because that is actually the same tissue body that the egg was inside the follicle, then that becomes the corpus luteum. So it's the same thing that continues. If we can begin to heal the beginning of the cycle, then you're affecting the second part, right?
Right, exactly. What's really interesting is nutrition is very important in having good fats in your diet. And this is actually showing the corpus luteum, the follicle after ovulation, making progesterone. Mm-hmm. And guess what it makes it out of? It makes it out of cholesterol. So here is the corpus luteum actually making progesterone from cholesterol in the corpus luteum. I think this is a really cool picture.
Yeah, this is an actual photo?
Yes. So it actually shows that it's fatty stuff. Okay, and if you actually even look on ultrasound at the lining of the uterus and what progesterone looks like, the glands in the uterus are secreting fats, and you see them. You see this layer and the secretion of fats as being part of progesterone production. So it's really interesting. So I don't know if the viewers are familiar with charts of the cycle. This is the fertility care or Creighton method, but there's other cycles or views of the cycle and charting that looks like this. I think charting is essential to really understanding your cycle. So you could figure it out in a FEM cycle, you could figure it out in a symptothermal cycle, but here's a couple ways how stress can impact. Okay, this can be somebody getting married or having some crisis happen. In the Creighton method, the red is your period, and then around when you're making the high estrogen, around ovulation, you get cervical mucus, and there are various ways of checking this, but these white baby stamps mean your fertile period and that you're getting the mucus at the pre-ovulatory time. Well, what happens if you have some kind of catastrophic stress right here? Your follicle actually right here, going back to this, is making the estrogen, but the egg doesn't ovulate. The follicle just holds onto the egg. Okay, so you don't know that at the time, but this actually didn't make a good ovulation. It made good estrogen leading up to ovulation. But then what happens is the body is very smart and it wants to be pregnant, I think, okay? And so another follicle comes along. And we see here that this is the effect of a new follicle, and then this is actually the real ovulation. And then finally, this one makes progesterone. But this is a longer cycle. Women with PCOS will have all these attempts at ovulating, and they don't have, and then finally a good follicle comes around. There's always, you know, many thousands of them in reserve until menopause. And so if you miss out on this one, another one will come along. And then this is showing another way that stress can impact the cycle. And this is a more chronic stress kind of thing. And so this person is actually ovulating, but one of the symptoms of low progesterone is bleeding at the end of the cycle, spotting. So in this situation, there's many different ways of treating this. Okay, so you can actually just treat this with hormones by giving progesterone, and then we see the abnormal bleeding improves and the cycle gets longer. In this case, it was treated with HCG, another hormone that helps both estrogen and progesterone. But you could also, I have seen people turn this kind of situation around with short cycles just with nutrition and addressing stress. So it can take a lot longer if you're 36 years old and want to be pregnant and you're trying to improve that. You can work on the stress, but at the same time, you're better off using some direct hormonal therapy. But you can actually approach some of these things from just nutrition or therapies for the stress. It's just slower and more difficult.
You're working on it at the source, right?
Right, you're working at the root cause. There are multiple causes of low progesterone. You know, another big one is nutritional and B vitamins and insulin resistance. You know, abnormalities in your blood sugar. That's super. But this happens. This stress effect on the cycle happens because of cortisol steal. So steroid hormones are cortisol plus the sex hormones plus some other ones of the adrenal cortex that regulate salt and water, but basically progesterone and estrogen, which are essential to procreation, have the same nucleus as cortisol. They all come from cholesterol. And this is often why very, very skinny people have problems, or even people who are heavy might have a low cholesterol. That can actually be a problem. Not, you know, it isn't just a problem when your cholesterol is too high. It can be too low too. So you want your total cholesterol to be 160 or at the very least 140. And then cholesterol turns into pregnenolone, which is kind of a master hormone. And if you're under stress, it isn't going to go through the pathways to make enough estrogen some of the time. And this pathway will be blocked off or make inadequate progesterone or no progesterone in the case of not ovulating. And instead, it'll be shifted over to here in this pathway and make excessive cortisol until you get depleted. So this is just a key thing, actually, and how it happens that you get the cycle disturbances.
Yeah, this is fascinating because the body's saying, wait, I don't have enough resources to both have a baby and have this cortisol reaction of, fight or flight or protecting my young, right?
And when there were women under extreme stress, like in starvation circumstances, concentration camps, that's the extreme. The menstrual cycle completely shuts off,
right?
And you don't have cycles at all, and have amenorrhea, no periods at all. That would be the extreme. But way short of that, there's impaired cycles.
But the body's going to move those resources to the essentials.
Another name for this is pregnenolone steal. Okay, that's sort of the beginning hormone of this cascade, but it's more commonly called cortisol steal.
Fascinating.
So maybe we should talk about some of the symptoms of adrenal fatigue. Fatigue is the overwhelming one. Sleep disturbances, brain fog, memory issues. Some people will have recurrent infections like herpes infections, viral syndrome, Epstein-Barr, poor response to stress, crashing in the middle of the day. It varies, but some people will have musculoskeletal pain, low blood sugar, where people even feel like passing out from low blood sugar. Some people will have irritable colon. Some people will have cravings for salt. And then, of course, the menstrual disturbances can be part of this, too.
Are the ones toward the top, are those the more common symptoms?
Yes, I would say fatigue and sleep disturbances. And then there's just variation in there, depending on the person. Not everybody will have all of these, and they're to different degrees. So maybe we want to talk about what you do. Okay. And so we've spoken about this already. Sleep. You have to have good sleep. Do whatever it takes to get good sleep. And so we mentioned phosphatidylserine. If you have the reverse curve, the sleep hygiene, but melatonin will work. There's actually some calming herbs that work. Theanine, and then there's other herbs like scutellaria, lemon balm. Having a bath with magnesium salts. You do things to calm the body down at night. And in severe cases, you may want to use pharmaceuticals. You may want to ask your doctor for a prescription drug like Ambien to use over a short period of time. Also, sometimes some antidepressants, like the old-fashioned antidepressant Elavil, people use, and that helps people quiet it down. And then a key diet thing is avoiding sugar. That is just really, really super important. So there are a variety of diets that can work for people, but a paleo diet, the Whole30 diet, low glycemic diet, just people vary a lot in their ability to process carbohydrates, but you want to avoid big shifts in your blood sugar, and especially using sugar to jack yourself up. And the most important thing is having adequate fats and protein at the beginning of the day, having your carbs later in the day. So if you have a protein-rich breakfast that has good fats, that'll go a long way toward helping your blood sugar. And then one of the reasons this is sort of this syndrome is dissed in Western medicine is because some of the best treatments are actually nutritional and herbal, and there's not much training in this. But there's actually herbal substances that have been around for centuries in Ayurvedic medicine, which has a long tradition, or Chinese medicine. adrenal adaptogens actually help normalize the cortisol curve. They'll stimulate it in the morning. Typically, you'll take these types of things in the morning to help your adrenals. So ashwagandha is maybe one of the best known ones, rhodiola, Siberian ginseng, and there's many other adaptogens that can be very useful. Licorice is another very good one. And sometimes if you're in the wired stage, you need a combination of these more stimulating adaptogens and calming ones. And then a key nutrient for getting better in some of the supplements that are good for adrenal fatigue are B vitamins, in particular pantothenic acid, that's vitamin B5, and then other B vitamins too. And then vitamin C, we see in the original research from the 1930s that vitamin C was a key part of adrenal physiology. So it's very good to take vitamin C. It's inexpensive, a couple thousand milligrams of that a day. That's a very good antioxidant. You want to make sure you have good vitamin D and omega-3s. You know, that would be fish oil, cod liver oil, you know, the good fats. And then one key thing is you can't over-exercise. It'll just make it worse. If you really are on the adrenal fatigue spectrum, mild exercise only is appropriate. And then as you recover, you can increase your amount of exercise. But if you're going to the gym and you feel horrible and exhausted later, then it's probably not good. And you need to change your exercise program for a while. And some people, even with the the very severe adrenal fatigue, need to stop exercise for a while and then gradually start gentle walking. And then sometimes getting to the root cause is important. Psychotherapy, you know, if there's if it's primarily mental stress that's bothering you, counseling for your marriage, addressing problems in school or with your children. You can also have problems with detoxification, where your body isn't processing all the toxins we have in our environment very well. The mitochondria are actually the power package in your cell that produces ATP, which is, you know, an energy chemical. And some people can have mild or severe mitochondrial dysfunction, and there's ways of diagnosing that and treating that. Food sensitivities can be huge. Dysbiosis, having bad bacteria in the intestines, can affect things. IBS, that's irritable bowel syndrome. A very good therapy is actually low-dose naltrexone. And so that's actually a drug that was invented for narcotics addicts. And it actually increases endorphins, which are the pleasure chemical, and it affects the sex hormone system, the neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and then it also affects the immune system, interestingly enough. So it's a very benign, inexpensive therapy that works for a lot of people, especially if somehow there's an autoimmune thing in addition to this. Like if somebody has Hashimoto's, hypothyroid, low-dose naltrexone can be very useful. Or there's an antibody that's very common. 5% of women have ANA, anti-nuclear antibody. And that's actually an antibody to DNA. And they may not have specific symptoms, but sometimes good diet and some of this kind of treatment and low-dose naltrexone can help the ANA go away. You don't necessarily have it for life. And very severe adrenal fatigue, sometimes we do use hydrocortisone in order to treat it, but at a very low level. And you know, lastly, we can't, you know, we have to remember, I think I mentioned this earlier, psychological or spiritual help can be very helpful. Sometimes it's essential to recovery from adrenal fatigue.
Yeah.
If it doesn't have purely a physical cause.
Right. I imagine, you know, it's all connected, our mind and our bodies too, right?
Oh, it is. It is.
Yeah.
So,
Fascinating. This has been so much information here.
yeah,
And I feel like I'm going to have to personally talk to you about this, but somebody who is suspecting this, Dr. Davenport, is there a particular type of medical professional they should talk to about trying to work on what might be the best approach for them? Instead of trying to go at it alone, or, you know, should they?
yes. Well, I would think in a mild case, I think you could self-treat yourself.
Yeah.
You know, if it were not life-threatening or debilitating. But sometimes you really do need the help in diagnosing. For example, let's see if I have diagnosis here. No, that's more of the treatment. Okay. You want to distinguish adrenal fatigue from other problems that cause fatigue. So you can be anemic from heavy periods. So I think you do need a doctor or some kind of professional to help you. You want to do a good CBC. You want to or complete blood count. You want to test your thyroid. A lot of the chronic fatigue or adrenal fatigue symptoms overlap thyroid. And in fact, if you have mild hypothyroidism and that's treated too aggressively too soon, you can get worse. So you want to kind of fix some of the adrenal stuff and then go on and start treatment for the thyroid, have that in place. One of the hormones back in the cascade of hormones is DHEA. That you can get a blood test for DHEAS, which is a form of the DHEA, and if that's low, that's actually an over-the-counter supplement. It's actually a prescription drug in a lot of different countries, but in the U.S., you can get it over the counter. And so sometimes 10 milligrams of that can be very helpful and raise all the hormones here. I mean, if we go back on in the chart here, DHEA is down here. But if you actually take DHEA, it will help all of the hormone production. But it's helpful to get it measured because not everybody has a low DHEA. Vitamin D is really important. You can actually have tests that measure your omega-3s. Most of the time when I'm measuring an omega-3/6 ratio, that's low for people. So you may think you have a great diet, but you really need to have more omega-3s from fish oil supplement, walnuts, chia seed, ground flaxseed. Those are all good sources of omega-3s. And then there's this enzyme called MTHFR, which is kind of a mouthful, but it's very important because it affects how your body utilizes, not absorbs, but utilizes folate. So folate is a B vitamin, and it's super important because folate involves making DNA and RNA and tissue repair. So if you're impaired and can't make good DNA, you can't repair your body, you can't make a good egg, you know, you won't have a healthy embryo. And it's very involved in detoxification. So some people cannot utilize folate or folic acid. Women are told to take folic acid before they conceive. Our bread, our wheat is spiked with folate, but actually too much of this for certain people can be harmful because for the folate, in order to be utilized in the body, it has to be methylated. It has to have a methyl group attached to it, and 1/4 of the population has genes that prevent that from happening. So the solution is fairly simple. It's just having a better supplement that has methylfolate rather than folate. But you won't know if you really need that unless you get an MTHFR test. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but then maybe the safer thing to do is getting a higher quality nutritional supplement that has methylfolate. So then you don't have to worry if you're the one, you know, if you're part of the 1 in 4 people that has this. But If you do a 23andMe test, you can find out if you have methylfolate. Some labs will do this. It can be incredibly expensive, but there's one lab called True Health Diagnostics that will do that test very inexpensively. But I think it's important to know that, and not only for getting pregnant, but for your future children. The MTHFR gene is implicated in autism, and we have a big autism problem in the US. So for healthy pregnancy and healthy kids, you want to make sure your methylation and your MTHFR is working well.
Fascinating. Wow, so much. Oh, thank you so much for going through all of this with us. I know I'm going to have to watch this probably 2 or 3 times and take a bunch of notes.
Well, I have a handout too.
Yes, that's right. So we will have, yes, for all you listening, there will be there's a bonus handout will be included in the All Access Pass. So Dr. Davenport, again, thank you so much. We're asking all of our guest experts at the end of our interview, if you would share with us a #1 cycle power tip.
Okay, well, the one I would say for your adrenals would be the 2 S's, sleep and sugar. Make sure you get your 8 hours and then control your blood sugar with appropriate dietary things, especially your breakfast.
I love it. Well, I definitely will be taking those to heart myself and looking into some of this. So again, thank you so much for today, for being with us at the Cycle Power Summit.
Oh, you're welcome.